Okay. Hello, Chris.
Hello,
Chris,
Eileen.
so happy that you've made time for this interview today.
Oh, it is my pleasure and honor to be with you and the rest of the convening.
And you're all the way in Geneva, and here I am back home in San Francisco.
Yes, we're on opposite sides of the globe.
My morning, your evening. So thanks for the time, Chris. I just wanted to start with a little recollection of how we met, because the this panel is really about the use of the arts to work with COVID, and it started by my meeting Susan Magsamen, who is on the committee that I'm chairing for the APA's task force on working with COVID, trauma during COVID, that's sponsored by the Trauma Division and then other divisions of the American Psychological Association. So it's grown into a task force. We had originally 75 members more, and we're writing a book. And so this is the only group that's specifically focusing on the arts. And during COVID, we discovered the power of the arts to cross cultures. We were first working as Susan and some of the other arts groups more nationally, and then discovered by using Zoom to help colleagues and friends, as I was doing with groups in China, India, and Turkey. The power of the arts internationally is very exciting. And so this panel is exciting because it's, I think, the first time we've brought together national and international groups. And finally, how the arts are being recognized for their healing power. And at a time when the world so badly needs healing, the arts are finally taking their place among recognized modalities. So, you, being the expert in the international use of the arts, and maybe just if you would just introduce a little bit about the World Health Organization, the white paper in general, what you're doing, and then talk specifically about what you did during COVID.
Oh, sure. No, I'd be happy to, Eileen. I, I mean, WHO working in the arts is nothing new in one sense. I think since our inception in 1948, we have always used the arts, but mostly in terms of health promotion. So, for instance, when the DOTS program rolled out decades ago in TB, radio soap operas were used to try and promote the health messaging to get people involved. In my own experience, more recently, I worked for many years in the HIV response in Africa, and we used storytelling, forum theater, other ways of engaging the community in health messaging. And of course, more recently, during the Ebola outbreak in West Africa in 2014, I was on the ground in Liberia and experienced firsthand the use of street comedians, singers, dancers to destigmatize, to put out the health messaging of hand washing, safe burial, etc. But one of the things that I noticed during my many years at WHO and using the arts as a tool, again, mostly as a health promotion tool, is that the effects went well beyond just simply the carrying of a health message, that its ability to create community, to give people perspective on an issue, not just simply receive information, and its ability to give voice to the unheard, had a tremendous healing effect that went well beyond the health messaging that it was normally associated with doing a mural on the wall of an African hospital, or a song about a particular health issue, or a television or a radio program. And that intrigued me. And so when Dr. Tedros became Director General, he put out this famous call to staff for crazy ideas. And he got lots of them, and many of them went forward. And my crazy idea was to start an arts and health program. And he was intrigued enough to call me into his office, gave me my 15 minutes to make my pitch. And it was really quite simple. I said, we know that data, evidence, and information are essential for identifying objective scientific truth, for solving problems, for saving lives. But we also know from the evidence that data, evidence, and information are necessary, but often insufficient to change people's deeply held convictions or behaviors. For that, you need empathy, often in the form of a story. And he agreed. But again, that was really more from a behavioral science point of view, not so much the intrinsic healing qualities of the arts. And that's where my personal journey came in as I began to witness it firsthand, began to work with centers around the world. You mentioned Susan at Johns Hopkins. There's also Jill Sankey at University of Florida. Daisy Fancourt, who is the lead author of our 2019 report on the evidence base for the health benefits of the arts out of UCL. That report is well worth reading. And one of the interesting things about that is that it does focus quite a bit on the clinical benefits, things like physical rehabilitation and whatnot, not so much on the arts therapies themselves, but other more clinical uses. So part of what we are expanding on in this network of research centers that's part of this healing arts initiative that I co-founded with NYU and a group called Cultural Runners is not just looking at the effects of health messaging through the arts, not just looking at arts that have artistic interventions that have a specific therapeutic intent, but also the primary science of what health benefits happen in the engagement in the deep aesthetic experience that may not have an actual health or therapeutic intent at all, and to me that's kind of the holy grail, because I believe that the arts evolved in our prehistory as a healing experience, as a religious experience, as a political statement, as a form of personal expression. There was no difference. It was all the same thing 70,000 years ago. And they've split off for a lot of different reasons. We now have a whole group of religious beliefs. We have a whole group of scientific disciplines, including health. We have the artistic disciplines. And in our world, neither the twain shall meet. But I happen to believe that from that common beginning, they still share some common DNA. And one of the most important aspects of that common DNA, frankly, is this notion of compassion, that each of those groups tries to build community and tries to find a way forward together in a positive way within their belief system. And I think there are many real, practical, and important reasons why these disciplines split off from each other. But I think it's also of interest to think about those commonalities and why they exist and how they're effective. We like to define ourselves by why we're different from others, but we rarely actually think about why we're also the same.
Yes.
And the differences are essential. I happen to believe that, for instance, religions, political systems, all those belief models, because they are mental models that are belief systems, they don't respond well to doubt, to questioning. And so they have a tendency to become intolerant of the counterfactual, of doubt. The only two belief systems that actually embrace doubt, that in fact, doubt is the engine of what they do, are the sciences and the arts. And that I think is interesting. I mean, there are exceptions, of course. I think in the case of religions, I think Buddhism probably is a notable exception, but it's I so when we talk about arts and sciences or arts and health, that's another commonality between those two groups is their embrace of doubt.
Wonderful. Yeah. Stephen Batchelor, a well-known Buddhist teacher, wrote something like "The Power to Doubt."
Yeah.
Buddhism. So he put it right out there. If I can add one thing to your list, I'm reminded as I'm listening to you, Chris, that one of the things we found in common when we met in Haifa was what I wrote down as post-traumatic growth. That so many of these, let's say, scientific or psychological modalities focused on symptom reduction. And
Yeah.
that's important, reducing pain, reducing depression, anxiety. Those are standard ways of looking at efficacy. What you're talking about is far beyond that. We might
Yeah.
personal growth, we might call it wellness. There are lots of ways of describing the power of the arts that go beyond what is easier to measure, which is symptom reduction.
Well, exactly. And I think that's one of the reasons why you see it is that it's much easier to measure cortisol levels than it is to measure hope, for instance,
Right.
as an example. But from a WHO point of view, it goes back to our basic definitions of health and mental health. Our definition of health is not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. It's the attainment of the highest level of physical, mental, and social well-being. It's an asset-based model, not a deficit-based model. And so when we talk about health in that frame, then the value of the arts becomes much more intuitive because, yeah, I mean, we can show that listening to music lowers cortisol levels, but is that really the value?
Right.
And in fact, I would argue that if reducing stress, that's a use of music. It's not all uses of music. I like to get excited by music. I like actually the dissonance and the conflict of music that gets resolved in an unexpected way. That's not relaxing. That's engaging. And I don't want to be an emotional zombie by listening to music or engaging in the arts. I want to be an attentive listener. I want to be a deep observer. These are all lost arts. I want to connect to myself, to each other, to the environment in a deep and profound way. I don't just want to relax, you know, but each to their own, I suppose. But when we look at it from a mental health point of view, the WHO definition of mental health is really interesting because it's a corollary of the overarching WHO definition of health itself. It says that mental health is not merely the absence of mental health conditions or symptoms. It is your ability to cope with the everyday stresses of life. It's your ability to find the highest level of your skills, your own abilities. It's being productive.
That does away then with the stigma, which we often have, of psychiatric patients. I have a psychological problem. In other words, segregating people who need therapy as having problems. You're coming from
and that's core to the WHO mental health approach. And then the last area is being able to participate in a community and help build community. If you can do all of those things, then you are mentally healthy, regardless of what diagnosable condition you may or may not have. And I think by changing from this deficit model to an asset model, it relieves a psychic burden of people who have chronic mental health conditions. For instance, depression. Can one truly be cured of clinical depression? I think it is clear that with the proper support, you can manage it and maybe even transcend it. and find those moments of joy. You can not just survive, you can thrive. But for everyone that I know that has actually experienced clinical depression, they've told me personally that it doesn't go away. It's always there.
Mhm.
You live with it. It's a partner almost, and it's and to me it's the difference between curing a condition and healing
Right.
somebody's response to the condition.
Right.
You know,
Perfect.
I lost my vision a number of years ago. I have less than 5% vision. It was it was not only a physical change, it was emotionally quite catastrophic for me, and socially catastrophic as well. I had a deep fear of whether or not I was going to be able to earn a living. I was going to be able to enjoy the things that I had gotten to enjoy, to participate in community events, theater events, whatever else. And over time, in my process, and much of this was through the arts, I was able to build up new skill sets, including echolocation, including um, a different approach to empathy as a sense-making ability, not just as an emotional characteristic. And what I discovered in that process is that it was more than just learning to cope with the deficit. It was learning to embrace the new skills that I was forced into learning, and then transcending into a new identity. So I don't see myself as being disabled. I see myself as having different abilities.
Hmm. Hmm.
You know, and I actually believe that because I've talked to so many other people who were blinded at different times of their life, and they all have a similar journey, and they develop such similar skills that I have to believe that a lot of these functions that we develop are hardwired into our neurology as almost a failsafe. And if that's true, then there must be an evolutionary reason for that.
Right.
There must be a a purpose where it, from an evolutionary point of view, a certain percentage of the population would be expected to lose their sight and develop these abilities. And the reason they would develop those abilities is because they would be some form of contribution to the community.
Hmm. Hmm.
So and in the disabled community as well, there's a very hot debate over this emphasis on trying to find medical cures to our conditions.
Right. Right.
Why?
Right. Right.
I mean, it would be wiping out all these other ancillary abilities that actually are a huge part of our culture.
You know, from a dance therapy perspective, my teacher Irmgard Bartenieff, who was the student of Rudolf von Laban, worked as a physical therapist, and her theory, just like we say the brain only uses what 20% of its capacity or something, that the body too help, and Feldenkrais does this, find alternate pathways to move. So if one is blocked, are you there? Chris, I think it's just frozen. And
Yes, you're back now.
okay, well, we should
Yeah,
have.
sorry,
No, 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 that's okay.
sorry about that.
We're actually at time. So
Do you want to talk a little bit about COVID just
I
for
do.
a minute or two, or?
Yes, I do. I would really like to. What did you do specifically to cope with COVID?
Okay, well, I think in the short amount of time that we have, I'll mention two projects, which were sort of the alpha and omega of the WHO approach to COVID. The first was, and this was before we started the Healing Arts Initiative, was the most gaudy example was our Together at Home concert online that we developed with Lady Gaga at the beginning of the
Ah,
pandemic. And that broke all records in terms of the number of people watching, the amount of money raised, the reach around the world. It was truly a once in a lifetime event. It was sort of lightning in a bottle. I don't think we could recreate that if we tried. But it was important for a number of reasons. It was important because at the beginning of the pandemic, we were able to use celebrity, song, story to gather the majority of the human population in a moment of shared attention to get out those key messages of hand washing, social distancing, staying at home, and honoring the healthcare worker. And again, that's more of a health promotional aspect. But even there, what was striking to me about that moment was by listening to the music together, by having these artists share their talents and their authentic sense of compassion with the world, it did help us create, even for a short time, a greater sense of solidarity. It built community. It helped us cope. It allowed us to express ourselves during a time of isolation and fear.
Beautiful.
And that is the healing power of art. It's not just the health messaging that may or may not be contained in it. So that was a huge event at the beginning of the pandemic, but we had many projects locally around the world. One of the more recent ones was at the beginning of this year, and this was more tied to coming out of the pandemic and a sense of recovery, was something we called the COVID Quilt Project. And it was in India, and craftswomen from around the country would create a cloth square that would represent their family's COVID experience,
Wow.
whatever that was. And there were two artists based in Jaipur in India that then took all of these tiles and created this monumental quilt and displayed it in the public square. And it was, loosely based on the famous AIDS quilt from the 80s and 90s, but it literally took the isolated individual experiences of people suffering alone in their anxiety, in their fear, in their sense of loss, and united it into a national tapestry.
Yes.
Literally. It was not symbolic, it was actual. And I think that was one of many examples around the world of people coming together. And these sorts of things don't get as much play as conflict, as division. And it's because media companies, frankly, don't get as much money off of dopamine reactions. They get more money off of cortisol and adrenaline reactions in terms of the response rate.
Always be more work for us to do, Chris.
Yeah, exactly. So I think part of our revolution in bringing the arts to health is to play that long game, to not succumb to the short-term fear reactions, the U2 reactions, because what happens when you peddle an outrage? You suppress the prefrontal cortex, you suppress the judgment centers, you become more vulnerable to misinformation. It's one of the great discontents of our society. But if you take an approach that involves expression, and to me, Carl Jung expressed it best. He said, loneliness is not the absence of people. Loneliness is the inability to express what matters to you most.
Uh-huh.
And if we can do that, and in an authentic way, in a deep midbrain way, then we can make those connections. We can build community through the mirror neurons, through the common sense of purpose, and that's a far more profound constructive and healing way of communicating than fear mongering.
Chris, there is no good place to end this conversation. And my hope is you and I can continue off screen for a long time and have, as we said, unfortunately, lots of work cut out for us. But yes,
Yes.
I understand. You know,
Oh, wouldn't it be lovely to make ourselves redundant
let's
one
not
day?
talk about cloning ourselves, but there are ways to do it. So, and it's all about, you know,
Yeah,
legacy,
yeah, yeah,
the younger generation now. So we'll get them involved. Chris, to be continued, I hope.
yeah.
And have a beautiful evening,
Absolutely.
Geneva. And I hope
And
to see.
have a great morning.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you. I'm going to just stop the recording now and say thank you again.
Bye bye.
Bye.